The reason, and it's just a snapshot, the reason I wanted to bring it up is who am I and why does it matter? Now, there's a picture of my Canadian grandfather in there, and there's a picture of my German great-grandparents there. So great-grandparents, I live in the UK now, and I have roots in all kinds of parts of the world, and also my work has taken me to all kinds of parts of the world. Now, there's a couple of images that have been cut out, but with the Canadian side of things, there is an image of a Red Indian with a little bow and arrow. With the German, you would appreciate that. There's a lady with a big jug of beer. And with the Brit, you may just be able to see there's a British plod and the British flag. Now, the reason I wanted to start with that is because it's a kaleidoscope of images. That doesn't necessarily at all illustrate who I am. But if you imagine one of these things that you pick up and shake and then twist the front, I had one of those when I was a child, and get all those images together, what you get is lots and lots of different kind of colourful images, but they don't necessarily tell you who I am or what I do. Neither does this image. What we are seeing now in the world around us, in a world that is connected by an internet that spans the globe over and over again, millions, billions of pixels a second, is that everything is being reduced to big data. Everything is reduced to our digital identity. So what I would like to ask is, in this world where actually 258 million migrants, and if you think about that in 2017, and if you think about that, how many second and third generation, like me, I'm a second generation migrant from Germany, third generation from Canada. What does that actually turn us into, and what does that make us? And what is the role of storytelling in terms of defining our identities for this modern age? So I'm going to start, and I've got a couple of crib cards because there's some really important quotes that I want to read out to you as I'm going along. So this first one is about a narrative of exclusion, and it comes from The Conversation, and it was published in Neurological Science magazine in the States. There's a long-standing history of employing the fear of others, turning humans into illogical, ruthless weapons in service to an ideology. Tribalism is a biological loophole that many politicians have banked on for a long time, tapping into our fears and tribal instincts. Some examples are Nazism, the Ku Klux Klan, religious wars, and the Dark Ages. The typical pattern is to give the other humans a different label than us and say they are going to harm our resources. It doesn't matter necessarily, we can go from any kind of otherness, but the point is, if we are in a world that is using words as weapons and measuring us as data, can you imagine smaller and smaller and smaller pictures of me as a German beer girl, or me with the Red Indian, or me with the British flag, breaking down further and further and further and further? That doesn't make me who I am, but that is trying to tell the story, and that's what our digital world of algorithms is trying to do now. And I think that's quite a scary thing. So within that, what's happened? Well, we've seen the rise of absolute extreme right-wing politics. We've seen, whichever side of the fence you're on, we've seen Brexit, we've seen Trump, we've seen leaders polarizing, especially right-wing, across the world, be it Philippines, be it Brazil, be it Venezuela. This weaponizing of words is incredibly powerful, and it is spreading right across the digital sphere, and the platforms that are spreading it, Facebook and Twitter, amongst others. There's many, many different things. It's not because they're necessarily inherently wanting to polarize things, it's because they want us to click, they want us to react, they want to create identities out of words that they define because they can make money from it. That's the bottom line. It's about consumerism, and it's about making money. And by reducing us to a series of clicks, that's exactly what we become. So you've got the right side of the pendulum. You've also got the left side, which says that unless you're PC, that you have again, where you stand, gender-neutral toilets. There's all kinds of different things of the pendulum swinging. The reason I want to mention that, and the reason I find it's quite important, is, as Seb mentioned, my novel Mother of Floods, my debut, it's speculative fiction, it's coming out in March. And I have drawn one of my set of great-grandparents, or my great-grandfather on this side. He was actually First Nation Ojibwe from Lake Temagami, Bear Island in Toronto, up from Toronto. And I was told by my publisher that actually it would be a really difficult narrative to sell, because essentially I'm a white Brit. I look British, I sound very British, I've got a very posh accent, and therefore that's who I am. Remember those little kaleidoscope images? If that's what you look like, that's who you are, because that's what we're about. You can totally understand how important it is to give First Nation people their rights and their heritage after having been stripped of everything for so long through colonialism. However, I was absolutely taken aback, and I was actually really devastated that it would cause an issue of some of the narrative that I'd used in my book about trying to discover my roots was actually considered to be cultural appropriation. And that then made me think about how far the pendulum has swung the other way. Is it the case that in the need to be PC and politically correct, to overcome the extreme right-wing weaponization of language, is it that we've swung too far the other way? Well, Barack Obama certainly thought so when he spoke out a few days ago. And I don't know if you've ever seen the hashtag woke, the Twitter handle woke, but it's basically challenging anything that is considered to be, racist or sexist or anything ist that is people want to stand up for, but not stand up. They'd much rather do it from their living room chairs on their phones or on their mobile devices. So this is what he had to say. The idea of purity, and you're never compromised, and you're always politically woke and all that stuff, you should get over that really quickly. The world is messy, there are ambiguities. People who do really good stuff have flaws. People who are fighting may love their kids and share certain things with you. Now, I think that's a really important point, because remember that initial quote, the weaponization of words and the materialism that words have engendered and are being used increasingly to do so. What we're actually ending up with is propaganda that is happening all the time. So within that propaganda, we now have fiction presented as fact, and where authors come from, where writers come from, and the authenticity of what they have to say, dependent on their cultural or physical or geographical heritage. And to me, that makes a mockery out of everything that writing should be, because writing is about discovering and exploring and driving new paths of opportunity. So in a world where fiction is being presented as fact, shouldn't authors be able to find a way forward to create new paths to help fact become a more positive way forward for us all? So again, bear with me with my next quote, because I think this is very important. Zadie Smith wrote a piece for The New Yorker very recently. As you know, she's a very well-known mixed-race writer. And she challenged the idea of cultural appropriation. And to give you an idea of what that means, again, and I didn't know exactly what it meant until it was levelled against me. It's the idea of a dominant narrative or a dominant culture portraying a less powerful culture in a way that is in their paradigm. So, for example, in Margaret Mitchell's Mammy, the portrayal of Mammy as, the slave. I mean, we all know Uncle Tom's Cabin. They're typical examples. And what Zadie Smith says is that actually, for her, Mammy was a really negative stereotype. It had an implication on how she felt about herself. And we must never ever let that happen again, and we must be incredibly vigilant in terms of how we stereotype and how we write about things. However, she has this to say, about what it means to be a writer, and I think this is a very powerful thing and the responsibilities we have. Fiction, at least the kind that was any good, was full of doubt, self-doubt about all. It had grave doubts about the nature of self. When I depicted the life of a diverse collection of people in my first novel, that I was correct. But I was fascinated to presume that some of the feelings of these imaginary people, feelings of loss, of homeland, the anxiety of assimilation, battles with faith and the opposite, had some passing relation to feelings. I have or could imagine that our griefs were not entirely unrelated. And that to me, no matter where you come from, no matter who you are, it's that empathy that drives the narrative of a writer. It's that empathy. In the end, we are judged by whether our audience connects with our writing or not. So if we aren't able to convince the reader that what we're saying is real, well, then we might as well go home in the first place. However, I believe that in this world, and I come back, in this world of otherness, 258 million migrants in the last UN refugee report of 2017, with second and third generation, all of us coming together in a huge melting pot. Surely we need the power of fiction to help us define a narrative to build something new and something different that's not just a Frankenstein's monster of plastered together ideas and things that big data thinks we should be defined as. Now, I come back to this idea. There's a wonderful Indian-born academic who is now teaching in Columbia. She was born in 1942. And she was told, I came across her when I watched an interview, because someone had told her that because she now lived in Canada and the US, and she really wasn't in India very much, she didn't have the right to speak as an Indian woman. She was one thing. She was now, in the US and Canada, living in a first world scenario as an academic. So therefore, she did not have the right to speak as a third world woman. And I think that is when things get really, really dangerous, because if we are to build a narrative that connects us all and makes it possible for us to live in a new way, and I'm not just being ideological here, we have all kinds of examples where it's possible, and I'm going to come back to one of those in a minute, which struck me so strongly. But if we are to create a new way, we must be allowed to hear people from all kinds of different second and third generation backgrounds and people who are now not living in the places that they started off. And what she had to say was that 100 years ago it was impossible for me to speak for the precise reason that makes it only too possible for me to speak in certain circles now. I see in that a kind of reversal, which again is a little suspicious. So in my case, a woman with authentic Canadian roots, First Nation Canadian roots, who's trying to explore some of them through her writing, surely that links to that. Surely I am more than just my accent or the fact that I live in the UK now. Now, one of the publications that I created in my work was Nina Iraq. And Nina magazine was a magazine for Iraqi women, and it was about connecting the Iraqi diaspora, which at the time numbered about 5 million, this was 2014, to Iraqi women in country, because the culture of oppression towards women had gone so, because of wars, had changed so radically again. So from women being doctors and wearing bikinis in the 1960s and 70s, they're now in burqas and the full black regalia again in many of the places. And this magazine was a way of changing that narrative and connecting and showing that they're sisters no matter where. It created a safe space for them to interact. Now, that magazine is still going. ISIS invaded, as you know, in 2014, and the World Bank stopped funding. We made 100,000 on the first issue, which allowed us to bring out a second print issue. But that magazine is still going. It is run by young men and women from the world over, and young men and women in Iraq. And that is something I'm tremendously proud of, because it creates a safe space to be and to say and to tell stories. Now, there's another quote, and I hope I'm not boring you with these quotes, but I do think they're really precious, that was published in the bookseller this February, and it was talking about diversity in writing. But I would like to think it wasn't talking about the tick box diversity in writing, rather it was trying to get to the root of the issue. And this is what it had to say. Publishing lies at the intersection of entertainment, information, and education, and is a method by which we record our culture. In publishing, we are custodians of our culture. I've given you an example of that in terms of some of the magazine publishing that I've done. But I believe, further still, that it's incredibly important for book publishers to react to this. As we know, much of the publishing industry is still very white and middle class, although there's a lot changing. Golansk, for example, has just announced a BAME submission window for writers of different descent because there are so few science fiction writers who aren't white middle class. But the reason I think that is so important is because we need that safe space, not just in non-fiction, not just in magazines or in newspapers. We need that safe space in fiction as well, where people can say and be what they think they should be. Now, there was a wonderful story by when I was working in Morocco, and I was speaking at a conference around impact investment, and I met Najaf, who was on that picture, and she was 22, and again, bear in mind this was, we're not that far from the Arab Spring, it's about 2016, and she said, it is not a right to be included or to be part of, it is something that needs to be earned. Now think about that, that's something really harsh. This is something a 22-year-old woman said to me. Now that's something her dad said to her. And she has gone on to be a really powerful campaigner because she believes that she has to create and drive change, not because it's a given, but because it is something she needs to demand and take. To me, that is cultural, and as a feminist, it's something incredibly powerful from a gender issue as well. The reason that matters in terms of fiction is because she was one of the women who inspired me to write my novel, Mother of Floods. I've been very lucky in my work. I've worked in Zimbabwe, I've worked in Zambia, I've worked in Iraq, I've worked in Indonesia, I've been to many places in the world. And the women I have met, women and men, but remember Zadie Smith's quote, the bit about empathy. That empathy, one woman to another. Lemia sending her daughters, who were 9 and 10 at the time, across to Turkey because she was terrified that when she came home from work at the World Bank in Iraq, they would be blown to smithereens. There are so many stories like that. Badinam, who had to flee her home country because she had been a gynecologist for Saddam Hussein. There are so many stories like that. And each one of those stories kicks you in the gut and makes you think, aren't I lucky? And in fiction, I'm allowed to take that further. So Mother of Floods, it's about 4 women, surprisingly enough, having the courage to hit the reset button in their life. They come from Indonesia, from Zimbabwe, Martha, who's in the UK, and some of the family in Canada. It's connected by a sentient internet. I did say it is speculative, you think Margaret Atwood, but fundamentally I'm able to take some of these ideas and some of these people and some of the powerful stories I have met, and I'm able to shift and move them and translate them into fiction. So a safe space to write. A safe space to write is also the magazines I've created. Online and in print, there'll be some upstairs. They're all about finding a way for people to express themselves and to tell the stories that matter. So in the end, who am I and why does it matter? The experiences I've had and the work that I've done means that I believe I have a certain amount of empathy. But more than anything, I have a hunger and I have a passion to move beyond what I've been told I should be and to attempt to be who I can be. And why should that stop with me? It should include all of us And that is where the work of fiction, that's where the word of imagination can take us. And I'm going to finish on this. I've spent my life building my identity. Earning the right to speak out as a person I choose to be. It's up to the reader, or in your case, the listener, to determine if I've done a good job. I have chosen to create a safe space for my own voice and invite others to join me. I wrote this poem when I was in Sligo this summer, which is another part of my family's story, as my husband is part Scottish and Northern Irish, so my children are even more mongrels than I am. However, Ireland again is a very powerful place with deep cultural roots globally, and I call this poem a Sligo poem. The wisdom of my ancestors runs through bones that hold me upright as I run towards the future, whilst cupping the delicate flame of now in my hands. That is my responsibility. That's who I am. And in the words of a fellowship that's very precious to me, one day at a time, I create my story. But for now, this is the end of mine. Thank you so much.